How did a civilization that once led the world in knowledge and ethics fall into such disrepair? In this deep dive, based on Chapter 5 of Zafarullah Khan's Islam in the Contemporary World, we confront the harsh realities of educational, scientific, and moral decline in the Muslim world and explore what it will take to rise again. Welcome, everyone. Today we're really digging into Chapter 5 of Zafarullah Khan's book, Islam in the Contemporary World, a new narrative.
Yeah.
Our goal here is to, understand the author's argument. Why does he think the Muslim world is in its current state? And what insights does he offer? What's the path forward, according to him?
And Khan is very direct in this chapter. He calls the situation a lowest ebb of broken pride. But what's really central to his argument, his core premise, is that this isn't mainly because of outside forces.
Okay, not external factors.
Not primarily, no. He really points inward. He talks about the Muslim world's own indolence and negligence, and importantly, a disobedience of natural laws and divine laws, too. He sees it as a direct result, even citing Quranic verses like 35.43 and 13.11, which basically say, God doesn't change a people's condition until they change what's within themselves.
So it's not like a sudden collapse in his view. It's more of a gradual thing, a consequence of actions or maybe inaction.
Precisely, a cumulative effect over time. And to build this case, the chapter looks systematically at, several key areas where he sees this decline really starkly.
Which areas are those?
He covers educational backwardness, poverty, health issues, research and development, or the lack thereof, military weakness, political repression, and then kind of underpinning a lot of this, what he calls the misinterpretation of Islam.
Okay, quite a list. Let's start with that first one. Educational backwardness. This feels particularly significant given the history, right?
Absolutely. Islam has this incredible historical emphasis on knowledge. The source makes sure to remind us of that. It points to the Quranic story of Adam, where knowledge is what sets him apart. And the very first word revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was Iqra.
Read.
Exactly, read. And this wasn't just theory. It led to this, golden age of learning.
Right, founding some of the world's earliest major universities.
That's it. The source mentions Al-Qarawiyyin, founded way back in 859 AD, Al-Azhar in 972 AD, the Nizamiya network later on. These were pioneers. He even includes that powerful quote from Iqbal, suggesting modern civilization rose from the dust of our feet, acknowledging that huge contribution.
But then you look at the picture the chapter paints up today, and the contrast is, it's pretty jarring.
It really is.
Yeah.
Khan presents data arguing that, educationally, Muslims are now the most backward community globally. Literacy rates, for example.
How bad are they?
Well, the OIC average is around 72%, but he notes that in places like sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, within the OIC, it's much lower. He uses this striking figure. 6 out of 10 Muslims globally cannot read.
6 out of 10, wow. Compared to a world average of about 80% literacy.
A big gap. And the investment in education seems to mirror that.
Low spending.
Very low on average. OIC countries spend about 2.7% of GDP on education, while the global average is closer to 4%. And even when a country seems to spend a higher percentage, like Tunisia at 7.2% of the source, the author argues the actual amount spent can be far less in real terms than, say, France spending 5.7% of a much larger GDP.
The numbers on universities are also quite telling.
Definitely. Get this. Japan, just one country, has more universities, 778, than all 57 Muslim countries combined, which the source puts at under 600.
That's incredible compared to India with over 8,000 or the U.S. with over 5,700.
It highlights the scale. He makes another sharp comparison. Harvard's annual budget over $4 billion back in FY13 against the combined education budgets of many entire Muslim countries.
And what about the output, like PhDs, high-level research?
Yeah, the source claims Oxford University alone awards more PhDs in 1 year than all the universities in the 57 Muslim countries put together. He used Pakistan as an example, awarding only 620 PhDs in 2010.
So a real bottleneck in producing top-tier researchers.
Which naturally leads to fewer scientists. The average in the Muslim world is cited as just 230 scientists per million people.
Compared to over 4,000 in the U.S. or 5,000 in Japan?
Exactly. And participation in higher education, tertiary education, is also much lower in many Muslim countries. Often below 2.5%, he says, compared to much higher rates elsewhere.
Even at the primary level?
Even there. Teacher-to-pupil ratios can be very high. He mentions Mali at 1 to 56, Pakistan at 1 to 39. Suggests very overcrowded classrooms in places.
It's a consistent picture of, under-resourcing and underperformance across the board in education.
It is. And then the author brings in a metric that some might find controversial, but it really drives home the point about the impact of this gap.
Which metric is that?
The Nobel Prize comparison.
Oh, okay. between Muslims and Jews.
Yes. He contrasts the world's 1.6 billion Muslims with roughly 14 million Jews. And he highlights the, disproportionately large number of Nobel Prizes won by Jewish individuals, especially in science and economics.
Despite their much smaller population.
Right. And he notes the few Muslim winners, like Abdus Salam or Ahmed Zewail, often providing context the author feels is relevant, like their particular background or where they did their main research, often in the West.
So the point isn't just the low number, but what it signifies about contribution at the absolute peak of global intellectual achievement.
Exactly. It's used as a stark indicator of the distance travels from that historical golden age to the present reality, according to Khan.
Okay. Moving on from education, the chapter tackles the economic situation next.
And the description is blunt. Miserable. He looks at the combined GDP of the OIC countries using purchasing power parity, around $7.7 trillion.
Which sounds like a lot, but how does it compare?
Well, it's less than the U.S. economy alone, which was over $18 trillion PPP then, or China's at over $16 trillion PPP.
And individual income per capita.
That shows the disparities even more clearly. You compare, say, Pakistan at around $5,000 PPP per capita, or Afghanistan closer to $1,900, with somewhere like Singapore at over $80,000, or Switzerland over $50,000. It's a huge range, with many Muslim countries towards the lower end.
And poor economic conditions often go hand in hand with health challenges.
They do. The chapter notes a low average life expectancy in the Muslim world, around 50 years cited in the source, which is drastically lower than, say, Japan or Spain at close to 80.
Is there a reason given for this beyond just economics?
Well, the author points out what he sees as an irony. He observes a tendency towards fatalism, accepting death as God's will without necessarily seeking treatment, even though he argues Islam actually makes seeking proper medical care obligatory.
So a sort of disconnect between belief and health-seeking behavior, in his view.
That's what he suggests. And the spending figures seem to reflect a lower priority, too. Health expenditure as a percentage of GDP in Muslim countries is, on average, about half the world average. He also highlights diseases linked to poverty, like tuberculosis, calling it the child of poverty. He mentions staggering numbers like 3 million contracting it annually in the Muslim world and 5 Muslim countries being among the top 22 globally for TB burden.
That's devastating. What about broader measures like the Human Development Index?
The HDI gives a wider view, combining health, education, and income. Developed countries score very high, above 0.9. Some Muslim countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE are in the higher OIC bracket, but still below that top tier. But crucially, Khan notes that many of the countries with the lowest HDI scores globally are Muslim-majority states. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sudan, Mali are mentioned. And there's a direct link shown to life expectancy, around 62 years in those low HDI Muslim countries versus 80 in the top 10 globally.
And does gender factor in? The Gender Development Index?
Yes, and it shows similar patterns. Qatar ranks highest among Muslim countries at 32nd globally, but many others are near the very bottom of the list. Bangladesh 142, Pakistan 147, Afghanistan 171, according to the source.
Okay, so education, economy, health.
Yeah.
The next area is research and development, R&D. Critical for the future, right?
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
But Khan finds the state of R&D in the Muslim world not encouraging. Developed countries just dominate the spending globally. About 80% of all R&D investment comes from them. The U.S. spends hundreds of billions, China hundreds of billions.
And the comparison for Muslim countries.
The figures cited from around 2010 show Turkey spending about $15 billion, Pakistan $2.4 billion, Saudi Arabia $1.8 billion. These are tiny fractions.
Which means fewer researchers too, presumably.
Drastically fewer. The average number of researchers per million people in the Muslim world is given as at 649. Compare that to the EU average of over 6,400. The percentage of female researchers is also lower than the world average.
So a real deficit in investing in innovation and future growth. Next up is military weakness. The source brings in a Quranic reference here.
Yes, verse 8.6 which commands Muslims to prepare strength. But the author's assessment is stark. Currently, Muslims form the weakest ummah, the weakest global community.
He provides examples.
He does, citing recent conflicts and the scale of destruction in Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Syria in the early 21st century. He talks about sacred sites in Iraq falling under foreign control. He also points out that OIC resolutions against invasions were basically ignored, and some member states even provided bases for those military operations.
What about spending? Does that tell a story?
It does. The top 10 global military spend over $1 trillion combined annually. The U.S. nearly $600 billion, China over $200 billion, Saudi Arabia is the only Muslim country in that top 10, spending around $87 billion.
But spending doesn't always equal capability, right?
Exactly. The author notes that even with that spending, the Saudi military is not considered worthy in terms of actual operational strength. He says Pakistan barely makes the list of strong militaries, and generally, Muslim armies lack modern capability.
Even with equipment, like tanks.
Well, some have large numbers of tanks. Syria, Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey are mentioned. But he stresses the urgent need for modernization. He contrasts this reliance on older hardware, like decades-old fighter aircrafts, with the shift in modern armies towards things like drones, advanced tech. It's a qualitative gap as much as quantitative.
This lack of strength seems connected to the next point, political repression.
It does. Khan argues that not a single Muslim country currently has a political system genuinely based on shura mutual consultation. He uses the example of Mullah Umar's Taliban regime in Afghanistan quite extensively.
What's his take on that?
He portrays it as a system where Mullah Umar had total control, implemented his own harsh version of Sharia, and ultimately, he says, tarnished the image of Islam globally.
Are there specific examples mentioned?
Yes, quite disturbing ones. Punishing men for having short beards by locking them in shipping containers because they lacked jails. He notes the terrible irony that the Northern Alliance later did the same thing to Taliban prisoners, and of course, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. He calls it an act of utter indifference to minorities, a deep ignorance of history and even the Prophet's own conduct.
So he contrasts their actions with historical precedent.
Right. He essentially calls their approach in Islam of the Age of Caves primitive, lacking reason. He feels it dealt a fatal blow to the global image of Muslims, and he laments that there aren't strong popular movements for genuine democracy or enlightenment. He finds many existing groups tend to be authoritarian, sectarian, or promote ideas he sees as irrational and backward-looking.
He brings in another quote from Iqbal here.
Yes, reflecting on a perceived lack of principled leadership today. And he supports this view with external data, like the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index.
And the rankings there.
No Muslim country in the top 20. Indonesia is highest among them at 49th, then Tunisia 57th, all the way down to Syria at 166 out of 167 countries listed. It paints a bleak picture of political freedom in many places.
Which leads us to what the author seems to consider the root cause of many of these problems, the misinterpretation of Islam itself.
This really feels like the core of his argument in this chapter. He goes into the deep, damaging internal divisions, Sunni versus Shia, and then all the subsects within those traditions, plus Sufi orders, legal schools.
It's not just that these divisions exist, though.
No, it's the attitude. He states very starkly that every sect believes that it has the genuine deen, and that the rest of sects are infidels.
Calling other Muslims infidels.
Yes, and this mindset, he argues, fuels extreme violence and hatred. He directly links it to a distortion of jihad. He says the true meaning, which includes inner struggle, striving for good, societal reform, has been twisted into a justification for hatred, destruction, and homicide. He shares a really harrowing personal story here. A mosque attack in Muzaffargarh, Pakistan, back in 1998. During Ramadan, 27 people killed, Qurans shredded by bullets.
Just horrific, an example of that sectarian violence.
Exactly. He blames unscrupulous religious scholars with little knowledge of Islam. He recalls hearing religious leaders openly calling for the killing of members of other sects, labeling them kafir, infidels. He states bluntly that this misinterpretation of jihad has caused thousands of deaths in Pakistan alone and wrecked Islam's image internationally.
Does he connect this misinterpretation to other areas, like the economy?
He does. He argues that economic thinking is sometimes stuck in outdated modes, influenced by feudalism or interpretations that resist change. He gives a concrete example from Pakistan. Land reforms carried out by past leaders were later struck down by the Supreme Court, declared un-Islamic in the specific case, the Kozul-Bashwaf case. He sees this as an example of interpretation actively blocking needed socioeconomic progress.
So, pulling this thread together, the misinterpretation point.
Khan's conclusion here is that all these issues, the sectarianism, the economic problems, poverty, political oppression, military weakness, are, in his words, partly the products of the misinterpretation of Islam. He feels the religion that built a brilliant, progressive, scientific civilization is now often practiced or perceived as one based on superstitions and withdrawal from the world, hindering progress.
Which loops back neatly, if grimly, to his main thesis at the start.
It does. He argues that the current state of humiliation and disgrace that he perceives in the Muslim world is the natural corollary, the direct consequence of how Islam is widely interpreted and practiced today. He drives this home with one last Iqbal quote. It is the eternal decree of the judge of destiny. The punishment for the crime of weakness is death, implying that staying in this condition risks permanent decline.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive into Chapter 5 gives us a really challenging perspective from Zafarullah Khan. A perspective arguing that the roots of the decline lie within. We've touched on the educational gaps, economic struggles, health issues, the R&D deficit, military posture, political situations, and crucially, his argument about the role of misinterpreting Islam.
Yes, it's a detailed case, grounded in history and current data as he presents it, arguing internal dynamics and choices are key, not just external pressures.
It definitely gives you, the listener, a lot to think about. He's not just identifying problems, he's locating their source, in his view, in the very understanding and practice of the faith by many Muslims today.
Which really leads to a final thought, stemming directly from Khan's argument. If the way forward involves tackling these internal issues, correcting what he sees as deep misinterpretations, what does a genuine rise again actually look like? What would it mean to embody those historical principles of knowledge, progress, and unity he talks about, but in our incredibly complex, modern, globalized world? Something to mull over.